Hi, my name is Satya.
And my name is Rishab, and today we are reviewing a short story named Wlhelm that is written by Gabriel Roy and was published back in the 1950s.
So this story is about a forbidden love between a young girl and a young man named Wlhelm. Wlhelm is a man who came from Holland and is significantly older than this girl. They fall in love with each other through music. Music is their main way of communicating with each other, as the young girl's family forbids her to meet with Wlhelm, as they think he isn't the right person for her, and Wlhelm is much older than this girl, and he's from a different background and nationality. This only makes the young girl's love get stronger, and this girl tries all the possible ways to talk and hang out with Wilhelm. Wilhelm tries his best to maintain a strong relationship with the girl by sending her gifts and letters. But in the end, not everything goes to the couple's favor.
Yeah, thanks for the short summary there. I think you missed a couple of points. The music they play for each other is called Thias, and this music, they stay on the telephone for hours and hours a day, trying to express their love for each other. As like you mentioned, the young girl's family does not let her meet him because he's very old, and they are very skeptical of him. But we also see that whenever there's a love story between two people and their love story is mainly connected through music, there are a lot of conflicts that arise through this whole process. So I would like to see, or I would like to hear what you think are some of the conflicts that arise in the story.
Yeah, so basically, I see two main conflicts through the story which arise. And the first one is person versus society, and the other one is person versus self. So person versus society is when like the young girl and her family constantly try to persuade each other into thinking that Wilhelm is a good man and she's truly in love with him. However, her family thinks otherwise and forbids her to meet Wilhelm. And this conflict is strongly portrayed throughout the story. Another conflict which like the reader doesn't exactly directly introduce is person versus self, and the author does not directly display that. And the young girl uh, goes through self-realization, but as the reader is pretty clear that the young girl has a wave of emotion that she goes through. The self-realization part comes in when she hangs up the call midway of the music performances, and she realizes that Wilhelm doesn't truly love her, and it was in fact like a internal misunderstanding of her feelings. So
Yeah,
these are like two things which I feel that are two main conflicts of person versus society and person versus self.
yeah, that self-realization, what you mentioned there, it's gonna play a strong role throughout our conversation as we go forward. And the self-realization part is also directly connected to person versus self conflict, like you mentioned. Um,
Yeah.
and I think this self realization, this person versus self, also directly or indirectly, I'm not sure. It does definitely connect to this main message of the story, which I think is judgment and freedom, critical judgment and freedom. And critical judgment mainly, connects to self-realization. Do you make a good judgment about yourselves and about your current situations, right? How do we gain independence as humans, and how do we make a judgment that helps us gain that independence? So that totally depends on us and our situations. Now, in the case of the story, Wilhelm, who's an adult man who seems to be in his late 30s or early 40s, catches a young girl's eye when he moves into town. Now, this young girl claims to love him, but her family thinks otherwise, right? Her family, mainly her mother, like you mentioned at the start, forbids this young girl to have any sort of communication with Wilhelm by not letting her send letters, go back to the O'Neills, which is actually the young girl's cousins in a sense, where she first cousin's place where she first met Wilhelm. Um, Now, this lack of communication actually ends up resulting as a source of motivation for the young girl to pursue this relationship more with Wilhelm at one point in the story. Now, this motivation is also can also be put in other terms like reverse psychology, because when you tell somebody to not do something, their mind tends to think the opposite. I'm sure we've all experienced it at one point in our life. Now, this so-called motivation is a clear sign that the young girl is looking for freedom, which she clearly has not achieved. She wants this freedom. She wants to talk more with this adult guy, but her family just does not agree. Now, when we talk about judgment in the story, it is very hard to come to a clear conclusion about who made the judgment, right? Or even if there was a judgment that took place for a character in the story. we tend to ask questions like, was the young girl really in love, or was she just pleased by the gifts and the attention she was receiving? Did the girl have any idea about what love really is in the first place, or was she just trying to prove her community and her parents wrong into believing that she really did love this adult man? Love is very vague. It's represented in a very vague way in the story because, if you think about it critically, would Wilhelm really leave if he was in love with a young girl? Now, during the end of the story, that after this girl hangs up the telephone, right, mid performance, when this adult man is playing for her, right, um, when she hangs up, that's where their relationship ends, right, and the story skips 1 year ahead to where Wilhelm is now leaving Holland, going back to his own town, right? That makes us question, does that show love from his part, or was that just a temporary phase that both of the lovers went through? At the end of the story, um, does the girl go through that self-realization like we mentioned earlier? Does she realize she looks silly? Does she realize that she's too young for this adult man? I think absolutely, right. Even the young girl mentions it herself. She says, "I thought I must look silly, standing the stock still, the receiver in my hand. I hung up before the end of the performance." Now, this phrase kind of brings us back to the idea of love, right? Was there any love between the two in the first place? Now, that is what real judgment comes down to. That is in our hands, right? In real life, do we humans, when we connect to the story, do we really think in real life about a situation critically before making a judgment about somebody else or even ourselves? Do we quickly give up on ourselves? Do we know what the other person has gone through before we make an assumption about themselves? Or, sorry, them. In most cases, we don't, right? In most cases, we are completely blinded by the fact that, we are the only ones that have a problem in this world. Many people are just problem free. So we need to get rid of that thinking and actually think critically, make a critical judgment about ourselves. And yeah, so I think that's one
Yeah.
of one of the main themes I looked at. I would like to see if you have any themes in mind that you came up with when reading the story.
Yeah, of course I did. And firstly, how you mentioned was there any love between the first place was great that you asked like mentioned real judgment. And to add on, another main theme that I personally found was the blindness that love comes with. And there are obviously several portrayals of this theme within the story. So for example, the young girl's family is blinded by the fact that Wilhelm is a bad person, which in reality is a reasonable argument for the family. And why would an adult have a love affair with a young girl who's possibly in her teens? And it just doesn't make sense from a parent perspective point. And secondly, we also see the young girl, and she's blinded to Wilhelm's flaws and imperfections as she thinks she's deeply in love. But the young girl has trouble realizing her true feelings, and that like realization, self-realization, as mentioned earlier, comes near the end of the story. And the young girl seems frustrated and hangs up on Wilhelm playing the music. And that effect of mixed emotion is what blindness of love is. And that is another important theme and display in the story, which I thought
Yeah,
was
that's amazing, amazing theme. I actually didn't realize it when I was reading, because I never really got to see the girl's point of view, right? I didn't realize the
yeah,
fact that she was blinded to his imperfections, right? She even mentions near the start of the story how, his face looked sad. That's what everyone else thought, but she thought he was a way to love herself in a sense, right? She loved this guy, but then loving him also made her love herself, which is I think which what you mentioned, it directly connects with each other, and I think that's amazing. But now let's talk about some literacy elements, right? We know that literacy elements really give life and soul to the story. It helps contribute to the plot. It helps bring up main topics that we might miss. We might have misconceptions about different things in the story, and when you have these literacy elements, it really clears some things for us. So I'd like to hear from you, Satya. What do you think are some main elements in the story?
So firstly, I think symbolism is something which is really important. So for example, music, I think it's the main aspect to represent the relationship between Wilhelm and the young girl. So when Wilhelm goes to party at O'Neill's place, he hears like the music throughout the duration of the party, and Wilhelm plays like the massenet on the violin while the young girl is played by minute. And this performance eventually like leads to Wilhelm and the young girl talking, and Wilhelm like told like the young girl about her personal life and his family in the album later on. And And so basically that was how music was like not only like the foundation of their relationship, but also like helped tore apart their relationship apart in like a sense. And as the girl like listened to Wilhelm playing in like the music, their connection eventually grew apart, and her love towards music grew stronger. And this is why I think music is like really significant to their overall relationship and the story. And also like the telephone, it's like a small telephone that the young girl used to communicate with Wilhelm. It's also like a symbol in a sense, as it held their relationship together for like a longer time after her mother took away her privileges to meet Wilhelm. And Rishabh, I would like to hear what you think another element of the story is.
Yeah, before I state my thoughts about elements, I love the fact that you mentioned the telephone, right? Like it helps connect them together, hold their relationship together for a little longer. Now it
Yeah.
helps them in two ways. Not only keep their relationship together mentally, but also in a sense physically. Like it literally connected them. It literally held them together because that was their only way of communicating with each other. Now in real life, right? If there are two lovers who absolutely are in love with each other and they're only talking over this piece of technology, eventually there's a breakthrough, right? There is a breakthrough.
Yeah, there
Either
is.
one person falls out of love or the other, right? And this is what ends
Mm-hmm.
up happening in the story. This girl ends up falling out of love, right? So I think telephone is a great symbol that you mentioned. It's great, and it also directly connects to that other symbol you mentioned, which was music. I just love the way you put that. But in terms of what I think another element that gave life to the story is personification. Now, there were a couple of portrayals of this element throughout the story. For example, where the young girl says, "Love is so crafty," right? We know that crafty
Mm-hmm.
is not. It's a human. It's like a human trait, right? Humans can be very crafty at some points, but love, if you think about it, how can love be crafty? That this love being crafty is an indirect connection to how you can do many sorts of things with love, right? You go through many things when you're in love. You have this roller coaster of emotion. You're going through a lot, and I think language like this really helps develop the story, right? If you
Yeah.
read Satya, if you read Romeo and Juliet before, there are a lot of these unique words that Shakespeare he uses, like to show how much Romeo and Juliet are in love with each other. It just
Mm-hmm.
really helps connect. It gives a personal connection to the reader as well, right? So if as a reader, if you were in love with somebody, you would do all sorts of crazy things, and you can possibly relate to this statement of love being crafty. So I think that's a great example, or a great phrase that the author used to show personification. Another phrase was, quote, "Yet I felt death in my soul," unquote. Now we know that the soul doesn't die, right? It's not. It's not what happens, right? Humans die. A soul doesn't die. So how can someone feel death in their soul, right? Now it's another indirect connection to love, right? When your lover is apart from you, or you sort of seem to fall out of love, or they seem to fall out of love with you. You feel very dead from the inside. You feel
Yeah.
not so good. You go through again this roller coaster of emotion. So I think all of this just comes down to human trait, right? The author connects this idea of love to, first of all, to human traits, and then directly to the reader. So I think this is great use of literacy elements. It really again gives life to the the storyline here.
Yeah.
Not only is there personification here, there's a lot of use of other small literacy devices that are very hard to catch up on. For example, similes and metaphors,
Yeah. There
and
are.
it's just impossible to mention all of them in just one conversation. But yeah, so now that we have talked about elements, right, and how they build up the story, and we also talked about the main themes and how important that is, and self-realization, I would like to move on to the end of this conversation. I would like to hear your final thoughts on the story, Satya.
Oh yeah. So first of all, I really appreciate how you mentioned like the roller coaster of emotions and how you connected it to Romeo and Juliet and like your personal thoughts. I thought it was really good, and it actually helped me understand like your point of how love is so crafty. But overall, I think that the story was great, and I believe that the story could have been longer in length. if they added more perspectives and if they could have been portrayed towards the whole story. So, for example, I think like the family's views could have been more exposed, and like and her mother's perspective was like the perspective which was portrayed the most throughout the story. And if they portrayed like the fathers or if like other families perspectives, this could have eventually extended like the story, and it would have provided like a more interesting perspective and made the story more interesting overall. And that being said, I think that the story was well organized and written for different audiences. So for example, like young adults and older people. Like what I mean by young adults is like high school students or people in their late 20s who are married or still looking for like a relationship, and older people who already have experience with the relationship can like further connect to the story, and so they understand the story well and could obviously connect. So overall, I believe that this was well constructed, and I would for sure like recommend this story to other people, and I'd ask them to give it a read for sure. And in my perspective, I'll give the story like a thumbs up, and obviously like read this another time if I could.
Yeah, thanks for your opinions on the story. Yeah, and I totally agree with you on how this directly connects to younger audiences or all sorts of audiences, in fact, and how they experience love.
Hmm.
But when it comes to my thoughts on the story, I have mixed opinions. Right? Did I enjoy reading it? Well, not as much as I thought I would when I first picked it. Now, as you mentioned earlier, right, there's a lot of perspective missing to the story, right? We rarely get to see the point of view of the family, right? What was their mindset? Well, why didn't they like Wilhelm? We also see at one point the father mentions to this young girl on how to give immigrants or people who move from different countries how to give them sympathy and you should support them. So I would like to know why her father, the young girl's father, didn't approve of this relationship. Right now, obviously, there's a main reason because he's very old, but I'm sure there's something else here, right? Was there maybe a religious reason attached to this family disliking Wilhelm? So all of these questions remain unanswered for the reader, and this leaves the reader on a hang. And I personally don't like stories that don't have an appropriate ending. So yeah, I would also like to know some of Wilhelm's thoughts. Right, he's another main lover in the story. So I want to know what made him fall in love and what made him fall out of love. Because at the end of the story, as I mentioned earlier, the young girl hangs up telephone, and then the story skips a year ahead where now Wilhelm is leaving. So if he was really in love, why would he leave, right? Why wouldn't he try getting back to her, try all sorts
Yeah.
of things? So that really makes us question his love for this young girl. So I
Hmm.
think adding both lovers' point of view to the story would have made it more interesting to read, and it would have given more base, more root to the story. However, that being said, do I think the story is worth reading? Absolutely. I think the love represented in the story is very great, right? I mentioned this earlier as well. The young girl herself, we use the example of love is very crafty, right? And therefore, there could be many sides to this idea of love, right? So I think that's very unique how the reader experiences love. I think the setting also has a significant contribution in the story, and where the setting takes place is absolutely amazing, right? Now, even though the author does not clearly state the setting or time, it's very easy for us for as readers to assume where the story takes place, right? The music that was played by Wilhelm over the telephone was Thais, right? And if you search up the song, it's written by a famous music composer named Jules Massenet. I'm not sure if I pronounced his name right, but I tried my best there. Now, Jules was known as the best romantic composer at the time when he was alive, from 1842 to 1912. He had some very hit songs, and basically, Dias was one of them, and it was very trendy from the late 1800s and early 1900s. He was also known for his operas, which Wilhelm also, mentions, not very directly in the story, but he says to the young girl, I'll take you to the operas when you grow old. So that's another connection to the romantic era there. And romantic era, in fact, was at the top, right? It was at the top back in the 1950s, early late 1800s. So that pretty much sums up the setting, right? But now that we think about it, why is the setting important? Uh, I think it's important because it really represents this idea of true love, right? Like I mentioned earlier, this era, this where Jules Massenet was alive, it was at the top for romance, right? Lovers would really express their love for each other through music. And so that's just one thing I thought. Setting was just another factor that I thought I would mention. Nonetheless, I really do think the reader really gets to experience love in a very different way when reading the story, and that's what makes this story really unique, right? We see that the story also, like I mentioned earlier, connects with Romeo and Juliet, right? Romeo and Juliet's love was also, displayed through this idea of music, but not as it wasn't as strong as, of course, this story, right? But that's just a side note that I'd like to mention. So when we connect the dots here, I think the story Wilhelm really does represent a unique way of loving someone, right? And before we end this conversation, one last thing I would like to mention is that I absolutely love the way author indirectly touches on social issues throughout the story. It's very hard to pick up on this, right? But I'm glad I did pick up on it. The author was trying to showcase a leading issue in youth, which was racism and stereotypes towards love, and as well as mistreating immigrants, right? There's a lot of we see that indirect connection in the story to immigrants, and how the story or how sorry the young girl's family didn't necessarily like Wilhelm, possibly because of his nationality. So that's another
Mhm.
message I
Yeah.
feel like is very important to get through to the audience. And I just really love the way how the author, or in other words, Gabriella Roy, put that. I think it was
Yeah.
displayed awesomely. But yeah, those are my final thoughts out there.
Yeah. So I thought that like your thoughts were really good, especially how you like said about like the mistreating of immigrants and stereotypes towards love. And as like a youth, we can possibly like, connect to this, and this was like well displayed by the author. I truly agree with that. And from my part, I think that we've addressed all the points. And if there's no other final thoughts, I think we can end this interview. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this
Yeah,
interview.
absolutely. I think this is the end of this conversation. It was amazing talking to you out there.
Yeah,
And yeah, I would like to end it here. Thanks for listening, everybody.
yeah. Thank you.